They stripped his name from the registry at dawn. Every lord in the northern chamber voted without looking him in the eye, and when the clerk read the resolution aloud, the silence that followed carried the particular weight of men who understood they had just made the most dangerous decision of their political lives. Duke Caedric Veycroft stood at the far end of the marble corridor, listening through oak doors thick enough to stop a musket ball. And he did not flinch. He did not move. He simply memorized every voice that had spoken against him, because Caedric Veycroft did not forget, and he did not forgive. What happened next inside those halls, and what it cost every man who cast that vote, is worth staying for until the very last word. The morning rain had not stopped for 6 days. It came sideways off the northern sea, hammering the cliffs beneath Blackthorne Keep with a violence that felt personal, as if the sky itself had declared war on the fortress and everything it represented. The stone walls wept with moisture. The courtyard flagstones had turned into shallow rivers that carried mud and dead leaves toward the drainage grates, and the servants who moved between the outbuildings did so hunched and miserable, their faces hidden beneath oilskin hoods that did nothing against wind this brutal. Caedric stood in the war room on the 3rd floor, both hands flat on the campaign table, staring at a map he had studied 10,000 times. The northern territories spread beneath his fingers like a body he had learned to read by touch. Every mountain pass, every river crossing, every village that owed its survival to House Veycroft's grain stores and military protection. He knew the land better than he knew his own reflection, and he trusted it approximately the same amount, which was not at all. Behind him, the fireplace cracked and spat embers onto the stone floor. The room smelled of lamp oil, wet leather, and something older, something that had soaked into the walls of Blackthorne over generations. Fear, maybe, or the particular residue that power leaves behind when it has been held too long by men willing to do anything to keep it. The door opened without a knock. Caedric did not turn around. "You're late, Heron." Captain Heron Voss closed the door behind him and stood at parade rest, his boots leaving dark prints on the stone. He was a broad man, scarred across the left side of his jaw from a cavalry skirmish 7 years ago, and he carried himself with the rigid discipline of someone who had survived long enough in the Duke's service to understand that efficiency was the only currency that mattered inside these walls. "The eastern road washed out below the Gorin Bridge," Heron said. "Riders had to double back through the ridge pass. Added 4 hours. "I didn't ask why. I said you're late." Heron let the silence settle. He had served Caedric for 11 years. He understood that corrections were not invitations for explanation. They were statements of fact delivered with the expectation that the fact would never repeat itself. "It won't happen again." "No," Caedric said. "It won't." He straightened from the table and turned. In the firelight, the Duke looked exactly like what he was. 34 years old, lean in the way that men become when sleep and food are treated as inconveniences rather than necessities, with dark hair cut short enough to be functional and eyes the color of winter slate. There was nothing soft in his face, nothing decorative. His features had the quality of something that had been carved for utility rather than beauty, and the thin scar running from his right temple to his jawline only reinforced the impression that this was a man who had been broken at some point and had reassembled himself without bothering to hide the damage. He wore black. He always wore black. Not for drama, not for theatrics, because it was practical, and because he had stopped caring what anyone thought about his appearance approximately 1 hour after his father's body was carried out of this same room with 3 crossbow bolts buried in his chest. "Report," he said. Heron pulled a folded document from inside his coat and placed it on the table. Parliamentary vote was unanimous, 26-0. They formally revoked your hereditary seat and frozen House Veycroft's voting authority in the Northern Chamber. Caedric picked up the document. He read it slowly, his expression unchanged, the way a surgeon might read a diagnosis he had already suspected. "Unanimous," he repeated. "Lord Ashworth led the motion, backed by Houses Pemberton, Cale, and Whitmore." Ashworth. Caedric set the document down. "The man who begged me for cavalry reinforcements when border raiders burned his eastern villages 2 winters ago. The man whose daughter I rescued from a kidnapping scheme he was too incompetent to prevent. That Ashworth." "Yes." "And Pemberton." whose trade routes exist because my father built the roads they travel on. Yes. And Kael, who owes House Veycroft 11,000 gold sovereigns in unpaid military defense contracts. Heron said nothing. There was nothing to say. The facts were the facts, and the facts painted a picture of 26 men who had collectively decided that the Duke of the Northern Territories was too dangerous, too uncontrollable, and too unwilling to play the political games that kept the aristocratic machinery running smoothly. Caedric walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The courtyard below was nearly empty. A single stable hand was struggling to lead a horse across the flooded stones, the animal pulling against its bridle with the panicked stubbornness of a creature that sensed something wrong in the atmosphere. Caedric watched the scene with the detached attention of a man cataloging data. The horse, the rain, the way the wind shifted direction every few seconds, as if it could not decide which part of the fortress to attack next. "They think removing my seat weakens me," he said quietly. "Does it?" Caedric turned from the window. The look he gave Heron contained something that most men would have mistaken for amusement, but was actually closer to the expression a predator makes when prey wanders into an open field. "A seat in Parliament gave me legitimacy. Legitimacy made me predictable. Predictability made me manageable." He paused. "They just removed every reason I had to be manageable." Heron absorbed this. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing yet. Let them celebrate. Let Ashworth pour his wine and toast his cleverness. Let Pemberton write letters to his allies congratulating himself on taming the northern beast." Caedric moved back to the table and placed one finger on the map, directly over the capital. "Men who believe they've won become careless. Careless men make mistakes. And mistakes, Heron, are the only currency I need." He dismissed Heron with a nod and stood alone in the war room, listening to the fire and the rain and the sound of his own breathing in a fortress that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a loaded weapon. The second piece of news arrived 3 hours later, carried by a rider so exhausted that he collapsed in the courtyard and had to be dragged inside by 2 footmen before he could deliver his message. Caedric read the sealed letter in the corridor outside the great hall, while the rider was given water and bread in the kitchen below. The letter bore the royal crest of the Crown's Privy Council, and its contents were brief, formal, and devastating in the way that only bureaucratic language can be when it is used to disguise an act of political violence. A marriage had been arranged. By order of the Crown, Duke Caedric Veycroft would accept Lady Seraphine Vale as his lawful wife within 30 days. The union would formalize an alliance between the Northern Territories and the Southern noble houses. Refusal would be interpreted as an act of defiance against the Crown itself. Caedric read the letter twice. Lady Seraphine Vale, the surviving daughter of House Vale, a dynasty that had been systematically dismantled over the previous decade through a combination of debt, scandal, and what polite society referred to as unfortunate circumstances, but what Caedric recognized as deliberate financial assassination. The Vales had once controlled the most fertile farmland in the southern provinces. Now they controlled nothing except a crumbling estate, a mountain of unpaid creditors, and a daughter who had somehow survived the destruction of everything her family once represented. Caedric folded the letter and placed it inside his coat. A political marriage, a bride selected not by affection or even by mutual advantage, but by a crown that wanted a leash around the neck of a duke it could no longer control through parliamentary procedure. Give him a wife from a ruined house. Make her dependent on his protection. Use her presence to soften his image, to domesticate the wolf, to remind the Northern Territories that even the most dangerous man in the Empire could be brought to heel by the simple mechanism of putting someone fragile in his care. It was elegant. He hated it. And he recognized the strategy immediately because it was exactly what he would have done. He walked to the balcony overlooking the sea. The storm was intensifying, dark clouds stacking against the horizon like an advancing army, and the waves below Blackthorne's cliffs threw themselves against the rocks with the mindless fury of creatures that did not understand they could never win. Caedric watched the sea and thought about his father. Caedric Veycroft had been a man of warmth, generous to his tenants, kind to his servants, beloved by the villages that depended on Blackthorne's protection. He had trusted his advisors. He had opened his home to allies who later became enemies. He had believed, with the earnest conviction of a man who had never been truly betrayed, That loyalty could be earned through decency. 3 crossbow bolts, 2 in the chest, 1 in the throat. Caedric had been 17 when he found his father's body on the floor of this war room, surrounded by maps and documents and the spreading pool of blood that had already begun to soak into the ancient stone. He remembered the smell, iron and ink, and the particular chemical sharpness of gunpowder from the bolts. He remembered kneeling beside the body and placing his hand on his father's chest and feeling nothing beneath his palm except cooling flesh and the absolute, irreversible absence of everything that had made Caedric Veycroft human. That was the night Caedric Veycroft died. Not physically. Physically, he stood up from his father's body, walked to the armory, selected a sword, and began the systematic process of hunting down every person responsible for the assassination. It took him 4 months. He was thorough. The details were never discussed in polite company, but the results were visible in the way that powerful men began lowering their eyes when the young Duke entered a room. No. What died that night was something internal, something structural. The part of a human being that believes the world operates on principles more complex than predation. Caedric did not become cruel because he enjoyed cruelty. He became cruel because his father's corpse had taught him the most fundamental lesson of power. Kindness is a door you open for the people who will eventually walk through it to kill you. He carried that lesson like a scar tissue wrapped around his chest. Every decision filtered through it. Every relationship measured against it. Every human interaction evaluated not by its warmth, but by its threat potential, because warmth was what his father had offered the men who loaded the crossbows. And now the crown was sending him a wife, someone to place inside his fortress, someone to sleep beside him in chambers where his father once bled, someone who would see the machinery of Blackthorne Keep from the inside and who would, inevitably, become either a vulnerability or a weapon. Caedric turned from the balcony and walked back inside. He would accept the marriage, not because the crown demanded it, not because refusal would trigger a confrontation he was not yet ready to fight. He would accept it because refusing would reveal that the arrangement bothered him, and revealing what bothered him was the same as handing his enemies a map to every weakness he possessed. The Duchess would arrive. She would occupy rooms. She would perform the ceremonial functions expected of a noble wife, and she would remain at a distance so absolute that she might as well be furniture. That was the plan. It was a perfect plan. It lasted exactly 11 days. The carriage arrived on a Thursday. Caedric watched from the war room window as the vehicle rolled through the outer gates, its black lacquer finish streaked with road mud and rain damage from what must have been a brutal 3-day journey through the mountain passes. The horses were exhausted, their flanks heaving, and the driver looked like a man who had been fighting the road for every mile. The courtyard filled with servants arranged in formal receiving lines, their uniforms pressed and their faces arranged in the careful blankness that Blackthorne's staff had perfected over years of serving a master who treated visible emotion as a form of insubordination. Caedric did not go down to the courtyard. He sent Heron instead, with instructions to escort the new Duchess to her chambers, provide her with whatever she required, and inform her that the Duke would receive her at dinner. Formal. Controlled. A clear signal that her arrival was an administrative event, not a personal one. Heron returned 20 minutes later with an expression Caedric had never seen on the captain's face before. Something between confusion and what might have been, in a less disciplined man, admiration. "She settled in the East Wing," Heron reported. "She brought 2 trunks, a personal maid, and a case of books." Books. History, economics, military strategy, and what appeared to be a complete set of parliamentary procedural records from the last 40 years. Caedric's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recalculation. The kind of adjustment a chess player makes when an opponent's opening move does not match any predicted pattern. "What did she say when you told her I wouldn't be receiving her until dinner?" Heron paused. She said, "Of course he won't. He's establishing hierarchy. Tell him I understand the gesture and I'm not impressed by it." The silence in the war room lasted exactly 4 seconds. She said that. Word for word, Caedric turned back to the window. The rain had stopped. Weak afternoon light was breaking through the clouds for the first time in a week, casting long shadows across the courtyard below. He watched the light move across the wet stones and felt something he had not felt in years. Curiosity. It was an unwelcome sensation. Curiosity implied uncertainty, and uncertainty implied a variable he had not accounted for, and unaccounted variables were what killed men like his father. He crushed the feeling the way he crushed every inconvenient emotion, quickly, efficiently, without mercy. Dinner at 8, he told Heron. The formal hall, full protocol. Full protocol for 2 people? Did I stutter? Heron left. Caedric remained at the window, watching shadows lengthen across a courtyard that somehow looked different than it had an hour ago, though nothing had physically changed. The formal dining hall of Blackthorne Keep was designed for intimidation. 60 feet of vaulted stone ceiling. Iron chandeliers holding 200 candles each. A table long enough to seat 40 guests, its dark wood surface polished to a mirror finish that reflected the firelight from twin hearths large enough to stand inside. Portraits of Veycroft ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following every movement with the particular judgment that only dead men in oil paint can achieve. Caedric sat at the head of the table. He wore formal black. His posture was military perfect. A single glass of wine stood untouched before him, and the only sound in the room was the crackle of fire and the distant pulse of wind against the outer walls. She arrived exactly at 8, not a minute early, not a minute late. The precision alone told him something. This was a woman who understood that punctuality in a hostile environment was not courtesy. It was a statement. I see your rules. I will play within them, but I will play on my own terms. Lady Seraphine Vale walked the length of the dining hall with a stride that belonged in a military parade rather than a formal dinner. She was not what he expected. He had anticipated fragility. The surviving daughter of a ruined house should have carried herself like damaged goods, grateful for rescue, eager to please, desperate to secure her position through submission and charm. Instead, she moved like someone who had already surveyed the room, identified every exit, cataloged every weapon within reach, and decided that none of them were necessary. She was tall for a woman, dark auburn hair pulled back from a face that was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and green eyes that held the particular clarity of someone who had learned to see through people the way surgeons see through skin. She wore dark emerald, simple and expensive, with no jewelry except a thin gold chain at her throat that caught the candlelight when she moved. She reached the table and sat in the chair opposite him without waiting for permission. Caedric noted this, filed it, added it to the growing catalog of observations that was rapidly replacing his initial assessment. Welcome to Blackthorne Keep, he said. His voice carried the warmth of a tax audit. Thank you. She placed her napkin across her lap with the mechanical grace of someone who had been trained in formal etiquette since childhood. It's exactly as inviting as I imagined. You imagined this. I research everything, your fortress, your territories, your military capabilities, your political alliances and enemies, which appear to be the same list. She met his eyes. And you, Your Grace. I researched you thoroughly. And what did your research reveal? That you're brilliant, ruthless, feared by everyone who has ever served you, and almost certainly the most dangerous man in the Empire. She picked up her wine glass. It also revealed that you've been awake since 4 this morning. You haven't eaten in approximately 14 hours, and your right hand has a slight tremor that suggests either exhaustion or suppressed rage. Given what I know about your parliamentary situation, I'd guess both. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. Caedric studied her across the table. Firelight moved across her face, and in its shifting patterns he saw something he recognized. Not warmth, not gentleness, not the soft, accommodating expression he had prepared himself to tolerate. He saw calculation, cold, precise, systematic calculation wrapped in emerald silk and perfect posture. The same kind of calculation he saw in his own reflection every morning, the kind that kept people alive in environments specifically designed to destroy them. You're not what they sent me, he said quietly. No, she agreed. I'm what survived. Dinner lasted 2 hours. They spoke about trade routes, military deployments, tax collection efficiency, and the structural weaknesses of the Crown's alliance system. Not once did Seraphine mention feelings, comfort, domestic arrangements, or any topic traditionally associated with a new bride meeting her husband for the first time. She argued with him about northern border defense strategy, She was wrong about the cavalry positioning, but right about the supply line vulnerabilities. And she defended her position with a fluency that suggested she had not merely read about military logistics, but had studied them with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was the only weapon available to a woman in a world built by men who carried swords. Caedric found himself leaning forward. He caught himself doing it and stopped immediately. After dinner, he escorted her to the east wing in silence. The corridor was cold, lit by wall sconces that threw long shadows across the stone floor. Their footsteps echoed in counterpoint, his heavy and deliberate, hers lighter but equally precise. At her door, she turned to face him. "I know what I am to you," she said. "A political instrument, a condition of survival. I accept that because I understand survival better than most people in this castle." She paused. "But I want you to understand something, Your Grace. I did not come here to be decorative, and I did not come here to be controlled." "Everyone in this castle is controlled," Caedric said. "That is not a negotiation. It is a structural fact. Structures change. Not this one." She studied him for a moment. In the dim light of the corridor, her green eyes held something that was not defiance exactly, but something adjacent to it, something quieter and more dangerous. "Your father was murdered in this castle by people he trusted," she said. "You learned from that. You closed every door. You built walls inside walls. You made yourself untouchable." She tilted her head slightly. "But untouchable and unreachable are different things, Your Grace. One is a strategy, the other is a prison." She went inside and closed the door. Caedric stood in the corridor for a long time. The wind outside Blackthorne howled against the fortress walls. Somewhere in the castle, a shutter was banging rhythmically against stone, a sound like a slow, persistent heartbeat in a building that was not supposed to have one. He walked back to the war room. He sat at the campaign table. He stared at the map of the northern territories and tried to think about parliamentary strategy, military positioning, and the 26 men who had voted to strip his authority. Instead, he thought about green eyes and a voice that had said the word prison, like someone who knew exactly what one looked like from the inside. He poured himself a drink. Then he poured another. Then he sat in the dark and did something he had not done since the night his father died. He admitted, silently and only to himself, that he did not know what was going to happen next. The first crisis arrived on the 9th day. Seraphine had spent the previous week doing something Caedric had not anticipated and could not immediately categorize. She explored, not the castle itself, which she navigated with the systematic efficiency of someone memorizing an escape route, but the people inside it. She spoke to servants. She sat in the kitchen and drank tea with the head cook, a terrified woman named Marin, who had not been addressed directly by a member of the Veycroft household in 4 years. She visited the stables and learned the name of every horse and the name of every groom who cared for them. She asked questions, not political questions, not strategic questions, human questions. "Where are you from? How long have you worked here? Do you have family? Are you paid enough to feed them?" The answers she received painted a portrait of Blackthorne Keep that no official report would ever contain. A castle staffed by people who moved through their days in a state of controlled terror, who whispered in corridors and went silent when footsteps approached, who had learned that invisibility was the safest form of existence inside walls governed by a man who interpreted human warmth as operational weakness. On the 9th day, Seraphine walked into the war room without knocking. Caedric looked up from his correspondence. The expression on his face could have frozen water at 50 paces. "We need to discuss the tenant villages," she said. "No, we don't. The northern settlements are starving. 3 villages reported grain shortages last month. 2 more will follow before winter. Your reserves are full. The grain exists. It is sitting in storage facilities within 30 miles of communities where children are eating bark and boiled leather. The reserves are military provisions. The reserves exceed military requirements by 400%. I've seen the inventory reports." Caedric set down his pen. "You've seen the inventory reports. Your quartermaster keeps excellent records. He's also terrified of you, which made him very cooperative when I asked politely. You had no authority to access those records. I had no authority to let children starve either, and yet here we are." Caedric stood. The movement was slow and deliberate. The the kind of physical assertion that communicated threat without requiring a single word. He was taller than her by half a head, and in the confined space of the war room, his presence had the quality of something geological, immovable, dense, dangerous. "Let me be clear," he said. "The operations of this castle, its military apparatus, its finances, its logistics, and its governance are not within your domain. You are here because the crown required your presence. You occupy rooms in the East Wing. You attend formal functions when protocol demands. Beyond that, your role in Blackthorne's operations is precisely nothing." Seraphine did not step back. She stood exactly where she was, close enough that he could see the faint line of a scar along her collarbone, partially hidden by the neckline of her dress. A detail he had not noticed before. A detail that suggested Lady Seraphine Vale's history contained chapters she had not yet disclosed. "Your father fed those villages," she said quietly, "every winter, without being asked, without calculating the strategic value. He did it because they were his people and they were hungry. My father is dead. Yes, and the people he protected are dying slowly instead of quickly. Which version of Veycroft leadership do you think they'll remember? They'll remember the version that kept them alive. They're not alive, Caedric. They're surviving. There's a difference. You should know. You've been doing it for 17 years. The use of his first name landed like a physical blow. No one called him Caedric. No one had called him Caedric since his father died. He was your Grace, or Duke Veycroft, or among enemies who spoke in whispers, the Black Wolf of the North. His first name belonged to a 17-year-old boy who had knelt beside a dead man's body and decided that names, like feelings, were luxuries that got people killed. And this woman, this political bride from a ruined house, had used it like a key designed to open a lock he had welded shut. He felt something crack inside his chest. Not break. Crack. The hairline fracture that appears in stone when pressure is applied to a point no one thought to reinforce because no one believed anyone would ever find it. "Get out," he said. Seraphine held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. "The grain shipments to the northern villages," she said without turning around. "I've already arranged them. The first wagons left this morning." She closed the door behind her. Caedric stood in the war room, alone, surrounded by maps and military documents and the cold geometry of power. And he felt the fracture in his chest widen by exactly 1 degree. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself it was a provocation designed to destabilize his authority. He told himself that the slight trembling in his hands was exhaustion and nothing more. Then he walked to the window and looked down at the courtyard, where 3 grain wagons were already rolling through the outer gates toward the northern road, loaded with provisions that bore the Veycroft seal and carried the implicit message that someone inside Blackthorne Keep had remembered that power without mercy was just another word for tyranny. And Caedric Veycroft, the most feared man in the Empire, stood at his window and watched those wagons disappear into the gray horizon and did absolutely nothing to stop them. That night, for the first time in 17 years, he dreamed about his father. Not the body on the floor, not the blood, not the crossbow bolts. He dreamed about a summer afternoon when he was 12 years old and his father had taken him riding along the coastal cliffs, and the sea had been impossibly blue. And Caedric Veycroft had looked at his son with an expression that contained nothing except uncomplicated love, and he had said, "The measure of a ruler is not what he takes, Caedric. It is what he refuses to destroy." He woke in the dark. The fortress was silent around him. Rain tapped against the window glass with the patience of something that intended to keep falling forever. He lay in the darkness and stared at the ceiling and felt the fracture spread. And 2 floors below, in the East Wing, Seraphine Vale sat in a chair beside her window, reading parliamentary records by candlelight, and she paused on a page detailing House Veycroft's military expenditures from the year of the old Duke's assassination. She traced a line of numbers with her fingertip. Then she closed the book and looked out at the storm. "What did they do to you?" she whispered to the dark castle. Blackthorne Keep did not answer, but somewhere above her, behind walls thick enough to stop cannon fire, a man who had not allowed himself to feel anything in 17 years was lying awake in his bed, staring at a ceiling he could not see. listening to rain that sounded like something knocking on a door he had sworn never to open. And outside, beyond the cliffs and the storm and the black water that stretched to the edge of the known world, a ship was approaching the northern coast without lights, without flags, and without any intention of being seen. On its deck stood a man who had once called himself Chancellor of Blackthorne Keep. A man who had been presumed dead for 3 years. A man who was coming home to finish what he started. The ship made anchor in the cove below Gorin Point 3 hours before dawn. No lanterns, no signal fires. The crew moved across the deck and practiced silence, lowering the longboat into black water that swallowed every sound except the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull. The northern coast was a wall of darkness, the cliffs invisible against a sky choked with cloud cover so thick that even the moon had been erased. Chancellor Aldrich Morcant climbed down into the longboat with the careful precision of a man who had rehearsed this arrival 1,000 times inside his own skull. He was thinner than he had been 3 years ago. The flesh had pulled tight against his cheekbones, giving his face the quality of something architectural rather than human. His eyes, pale gray and utterly still, moved across the dark coastline the way a cartographer's hands move across a map. Reading, measuring, remembering. He had served House Veycroft for 22 years. He had watched the old Duke bleed out on the war room floor. He had stood beside the 17-year-old boy who became the most dangerous man in the Empire and had shaped that boy's rage into a governing philosophy so brutal that it transformed the Northern Territories into a machine that ran on fear and efficiency. Then he had disappeared. The official story was death. A riding accident in the mountain passes, the body lost to the river below. Caedric had accepted the news with the same granite composure he applied to everything, had ordered a perfunctory search, and had replaced Aldrich within the week. The machinery of Blackthorne did not pause for sentiment. It did not pause for anything. But Aldrich Morcant had not died in that river. He had simply moved to the other side of the board. The longboat scraped against rock. 2 men jumped into the shallows and hauled it onto the narrow strip of gravel that passed for a beach beneath the cliffs. Aldrich stepped ashore without getting his boots wet, an act of vanity so small it was almost invisible, but vanity nonetheless. He had always been meticulous about his appearance, about his words, about the precise calibration of every gesture and expression he presented to the world. That meticulousness was what made him lethal. A figure emerged from the shadow of the cliff face, tall, military-bearing, the kind of man who stood at attention even when no one was watching, because discipline had replaced personality so completely that there was nothing left underneath. "Lord Ashworth sends his regards," the figure said. Aldrich smiled. It was a thin expression, technically correct but devoid of warmth, like a mathematical proof of friendliness. "Lord Ashworth sends his obedience," Aldrich corrected. "Regards imply equality. We are not equals. Make sure he understands the distinction." The figure stiffened but said nothing. He led Aldrich up a narrow path carved into the cliff face, switchbacking through wet stone and seagrass until they reached a ridge overlooking the northern road. From here, Blackthorne Keep was visible as a distant cluster of lights on the headland, its towers cutting black shapes against the slightly less black sky. Aldrich stood on the ridge and looked at the fortress he had once called home. "How many men inside the walls?" he asked. "Garrison of 300, another 200 in the outer fortifications. The Duke pulled 2 cavalry companies back from the eastern border last week." "He's consolidating. Good. Predictable." Aldrich paused. "And the woman?" "The Duchess has been there 20 days. She's active." Define active. "She reorganized the grain distribution, opened the lower halls to household staff, visited 3 tenant villages personally. The servants are talking. The villages are talking. She's building something. She's building loyalty." "But what's..." Aldrich said it without inflection, the way a surgeon might describe a tumor. Clinically, precisely, with full understanding of the damage it could cause if left unchecked. A network of human obligation inside a system designed to operate without it. Clever woman. He turned from the view and began walking along the ridge toward the tree line. The military figure followed. The parliamentary vote removed his seat, the figure reported, 26-0 as planned. Ashworth delivered exactly as instructed. Ashworth delivered exactly as threatened. There's a difference. Ashworth is a coward with expensive taste and a gambling debt I purchased for 11 cents on the Sovereign. He didn't deliver because he believes in our cause. He delivered because the alternative was financial annihilation. Aldrich pushed through a stand of wet pines, branches scratching against his coat. Never confuse compliance with conviction. Compliance breaks under pressure. Conviction holds. And if the Duke retaliates? Aldrich stopped walking. He turned and looked at the military figure with an expression that contained something far more dangerous than anger. Patience. The deep geological patience of a man who had spent 3 years in exile, planning every variable, mapping every contingency, waiting for the exact constellation of political circumstances that would allow him to dismantle the most powerful duchy in the empire from the inside out. The Duke will retaliate, Aldrich said. That is not a risk. That is the mechanism. Caedric Veycroft has one response to threat: overwhelming force applied without restraint. It is his strength, and it is his fatal weakness, because overwhelming force without political legitimacy is called tyranny. And tyranny, in an empire governed by parliamentary consensus, is the one thing that will turn every remaining ally against him. He resumed walking. We don't need to defeat him. We need to provoke him into defeating himself. Blackthorne Keep woke to a morning that smelled like wet iron and wood smoke. Caedric had not slept. He sat in the war room with 4 empty glasses lined up beside a stack of intelligence reports, his eyes raw from reading by candlelight, his jaw set at the angle that every servant in the castle recognized as the warning sign to maintain maximum distance and minimum visibility. The reports were bad, not catastrophically bad, not immediately dangerous, but bad in the slow, corrosive way that worried him more than any direct assault. Trade agreements with 3 southern provinces had been quietly suspended. 2 military supply contracts were under review by the Crown's Procurement Office. A routine request for cavalry reinforcements along the eastern border had been denied without explanation. Someone was strangling him. Not with a rope, with paperwork. Each action was individually defensible. Routine administrative adjustments, standard review procedures, bureaucratic delays that could be blamed on staffing shortages or clerical backlogs. But taken together, they formed a pattern that Caedric recognized because he had used the same technique himself against rivals. Isolation by increments. Cut the supply lines, sever the alliances, remove the institutional support structures one thread at a time until the target realizes he is standing on nothing, and the ground has been pulled away so slowly he never felt it move. Someone was behind this. Someone who understood how Blackthorne's power structure actually worked, not the visible machinery of soldiers and gold, but the invisible architecture of relationships and dependencies, and political favors that kept the entire system from collapsing. Someone who had helped build that architecture. Caedric picked up the intelligence report on Chancellor Morcant's death. 3 years old. Riding accident. Body never recovered. He had accepted that report at the time because grief was not an emotion he permitted himself, and because Aldrich's death, while inconvenient, had not disrupted operations. The Chancellor was replaceable. Everyone was replaceable. That was the design philosophy of Blackthorne Keep. No single point of failure. No dependency on any individual. A system that could lose any component and continue functioning. But standing in the gray morning light, reading trade suspension notices and denied military requests, Caedric felt something shift in his assessment. Not certainty. Not yet. Something closer to the peripheral awareness a predator develops when another predator enters its territory. A change in pressure. A scent on the wind that does not belong. He set the report down and pressed both palms flat against the table. Body never recovered. The door opened. Seraphine entered carrying 2 cups of tea and a folder of documents tucked under her arm. She set 1 cup in front of him without asking if he wanted it, and sat in the chair across the table as if she had been attending war room briefings her entire life. "You haven't eaten," she said. "I don't recall inviting you." "You didn't. I invited myself. Drink the tea before you collapse and give your enemies the satisfaction." He looked at the cup, then at her. She was dressed simply, dark green wool, hair pulled back, no jewelry. She looked like she had been awake for hours. The candlelight caught the faint shadows under her eyes, and the particular set of her mouth that he was beginning to recognize as her combat expression, the face she wore when she was about to say something he did not want to hear. "What's in the folder?" he said. It was not a question. Seraphine opened it and spread 3 documents across the table beside his intelligence reports. Financial statements, trade ledgers, correspondence logs. "Your trade suspensions," she said. "The 3 southern provinces that froze agreements last week. I traced the authorization chains. All 3 suspensions were initiated by the same parliamentary subcommittee, a subcommittee that was formed 11 months ago and has produced exactly 0 public records of its proceedings." Caedric pulled the documents toward him. He read quickly, his eyes moving across the pages with the focused intensity of a man diffusing an explosive. "Where did you get these?" "Your archives, 3rd sub-basement, filing room 7. The lock was rusted but functional." "That room is restricted." "The rust suggests it hasn't been restricted in practice for quite some time. Your filing system, by the way, is excellent for the first 15 years and then degenerates into chaos around the time your chancellor allegedly died." She paused. "Which I find interesting." Caedric looked up from the documents. The expression on his face was complex: anger at the intrusion, recognition of the intelligence she had gathered, and beneath both, something he refused to name but that sat in his chest like a weight he could not shift. "You went through classified archives without authorization." "I went through your household's financial records to identify who is systematically dismantling your power base." "You're welcome." "That is not gratitude you're hearing." "No, it's pride. You're angry because I found something your own intelligence apparatus missed. That's understandable. It's also irrelevant. What matters is the subcommittee." She leaned forward and tapped one of the documents. 7 members, 4 of them voted to strip your parliamentary seat. The other 3 have no public political profile whatsoever. They appear in no membership rolls, no voting records, no social registries. They're ghosts. Someone placed them inside the parliamentary structure specifically to operate without oversight. Caedric stared at the document. Ghost operatives inside Parliament. A shadow subcommittee with no public records. Coordinated trade suspensions designed to strangle his economic base. Military supply denials timed to coincide with his political isolation. This was not a conspiracy. This was an architecture, a machine built to destroy him with the same patient, systematic precision he used to govern. And it bore a signature he recognized. "Aldrich," he said. The name came out of his mouth like something dragged from deep water. Heavy, cold, carrying the particular weight of a realization that changes the shape of everything around it. Seraphine watched him. She did not speak. She did not push. She simply sat in the chair across from the most dangerous man in the Empire and waited while 17 years of certainty about a dead man's death rearranged themselves inside his skull. "He's alive," Caedric said. Not a question. A recognition. The kind that arrives not as surprise, but as the final piece of a pattern that has been visible all along to anyone willing to look at it without the comfortable distortion of assumption. "I think so," Seraphine said, "and I think he's been alive for 3 years building the machine that's currently taking you apart." Caedric stood. The chair scraped against stone with a sound like a blade being drawn. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, both hands gripping the stone sill, his knuckles white against gray rock. His breathing was controlled, deliberately controlled, the kind of breathing a man forces himself to maintain when every instinct in his body is screaming for violence, and he knows that violence without direction is exactly what his enemy wants. Aldrich Morcant, the man who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, who had guided his first military campaign, who had sat in this room for 15 years and helped him transform Blackthorne into a fortress so impregnable that even the crown treated it with caution. The man who knew every code, every protocol, every blind spot, every weakness in the system because he had helped design the system. "He didn't just disappear," Caedric said, his voice flat. "He positioned himself. 3 years of preparation, building alliances I couldn't see because he knew exactly where I wouldn't look." He turned from the window. "He taught me where not to look." Seraphine stood. She crossed the room and stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he could see the pulse in her throat, the slight dilation of her pupils, the way her breathing had shifted to match the tension in the room. "Then look now," she said. Look at everything he taught you to ignore. The servants he made you treat as invisible. The villages he convinced you to starve. The alliances he helped you destroy under the guise of strength. She held his gaze. He didn't just build a machine to take you apart, Caedric. He spent 15 years making you build it yourself. The silence in the war room was absolute. Outside, wind hammered against the fortress walls. Somewhere in the castle, a door slammed shut with a sound like a gunshot. The candles on the table flickered in a draft that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Caedric looked at the woman standing in front of him. His wife. His political prisoner. His unwanted Duchess who had walked into a fortress designed to crush everything human and had somehow, in 20 days, mapped its weaknesses more thoroughly than any enemy army could have done in 20 years. "Why?" he said. One word, but it carried the weight of everything he could not bring himself to ask. "Why are you helping me? Why do you care? Why are you standing in this room looking at me like I am something worth saving when every piece of evidence in my entire life suggests otherwise?" Seraphine tilted her head. The candlelight caught her eyes and turned them amber for a fraction of a second before the flame steadied. "Because I watched my own house burn," she said. "I watched my father lose everything, his lands, his name, his mind, eventually. I was 14 when they came for the estate. I stood in the courtyard with a single trunk and watched strangers walk through rooms where I learned to read, where my mother taught me to play the piano, where I was a person instead of a political commodity." Her voice did not waver. It did not break. It maintained the same controlled steadiness that Caedric recognized because it was the exact same mechanism he used himself. Compression. The art of forcing everything painful into a space small enough to carry without it destroying you. I survived because I decided that no one would ever take anything from me again without paying a price they couldn't afford. You and I are not the same, Caedric, but we are the same species. He heard it. The thing underneath the words. Not sympathy, not pity, recognition. The particular frequency that only damaged people can hear because it resonates with the fractures they carry inside themselves. He wanted to step closer. He did not step closer. Instead, he turned back to the table and picked up the documents she had brought. "Show me everything you found," he said. They worked through the night. Seraphine laid out her research with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. Financial records, correspondence patterns, personnel movements, trade route disruptions mapped against a timeline that started 3 years ago and accelerated dramatically in the last 6 months. The picture that emerged was devastating. Aldrich had not merely survived, he had metastasized. From his position in exile, he had reached into every institution that supported Blackthorne's power, implanted operatives, corrupted officials, redirected resources, and manufactured crises designed to force Caedric into increasingly isolated and aggressive postures. The parliamentary vote was not the beginning, it was the middle. The beginning was 3 years of invisible erosion. The end, Seraphine estimated based on the acceleration of recent actions, was approximately 6 weeks away. 6 weeks until what? Caedric asked. Seraphine laid a final document on the table. A military deployment schedule obtained from a source she declined to identify. 6 weeks until 3 noble houses move combined forces through the northern passes under Crown authorization. The official justification will be restoration of parliamentary order. The actual objective will be the seizure of Blackthorne Keep and the arrest or execution of its duke. Caedric studied the deployment schedule. His face showed nothing, but his right hand, the one with the tremor Seraphine had noticed on her first night, was perfectly still. The tremor had stopped. When genuine threat replaced ambient stress, his body did not shake. It went quiet, the way a blade goes quiet in the instant before it cuts. The Crown authorized this? The Crown was persuaded, by a subcommittee with no public records, acting on intelligence provided by sources that trace back to a dead chancellor who is not dead. Seraphine sat back in her chair. Aldrich built a ghost inside the system, a version of himself that operates through proxies and paper trails and corrupted officials. He doesn't need to be present. He just needs the machine to keep running. Then we break the machine. You can't break a machine by hitting it, Caedric. You break it by removing the parts it depends on. And the parts this machine depends on are the same parts your father built this duchy on. Relationships, trust, The belief among your tenants and allies that House Veycroft serves something beyond its own survival. My father's methods got him killed. Your methods are getting you killed slower. The destination is the same. The scenery is just uglier. He looked at her. Really looked. Not the tactical assessment he had been conducting since her arrival. Not the threat evaluation, or the political calculation, or the careful cataloging of her capabilities and weaknesses. He looked at her the way a man looks at something when he realizes it might be the last honest thing left in a world he has systematically stripped of honesty. What are you proposing? Fight. But not the way Aldrich expects. Not with soldiers and threats and the brute force he's spent 3 years provoking you to use. Fight with the one weapon he can't counter because he doesn't believe it exists. Which is? The people he taught you to ignore. Your tenants, your servants, your villages. The thousands of human beings who live under Veycroft protection and who have spent a decade being treated like components in a machine instead of people worth fighting for. She leaned forward. Aldrich's entire strategy depends on you being alone. On you being the isolated, ruthless tyrant he trained you to become. Take that away from him, and his machine has nothing to attack. Caedric was silent for a long time. The fire had burned low. The candles had shortened to stubs, their light thin and yellow against the stone walls. Dawn was coming. He could feel it in the way the darkness outside the windows had begun to shift from black to the deep gray that precedes sunrise on the northern coast. You're asking me to become something I'm not. I'm asking you to become something you stopped being. There's a difference. He closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, he saw his father's face. Not the dead face on the war room floor, the living face from the coastal ride. The summer afternoon. The blue sea. The voice saying words he had spent 17 years trying to bury. The measure of a ruler is not what he takes. It is what he refuses to destroy. He opened his eyes. We start in the morning, he said. Seraphine nodded. She gathered her documents and stood. At the door she paused. One more thing. What? The tremor in your hand. It stopped about an hour ago. He looked down at his right hand. Steady, perfectly steady. It does that, she said, when you stop fighting yourself. She left. Caedric sat in the war room as dawn broke over Blackthorne Keep, and gray light filled the chamber like cold water rising. He looked at his hand. He looked at the documents spread across the table. He looked at the map of his territories, his kingdom, his inheritance of blood and stone, and 17 years of accumulated isolation. Then he picked up a pen and began writing orders. The first order authorized the release of emergency grain reserves to every tenant village in the northern territories. The second order recalled the household guard from the outer fortifications and reassigned them to village defense and road patrol. The third order, the one that made his hand stop moving for a full 30 seconds before he forced himself to continue writing, invited the heads of 12 tenant communities to Blackthorne Keep for a summit to discuss shared defense and mutual governance. Mutual governance. 2 words his father would have used without hesitation. 2 words that tasted like surrender on the tongue of a man who had built his entire identity on the principle that governance was not mutual. It was absolute, unilateral. A closed system with one operator and no appeals. He signed the orders. He sealed them. He sent Heron to deliver them before he could change his mind. Then he walked to this balcony and stood in the cold morning air and looked out at an empire he was about to rebuild from the foundations, while a dead man who was not dead watched from somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And 40 miles south, in a stone farmhouse overlooking the northern road, Aldrich Morcant sat at a table reading intercepted copies of every order Caedric had just signed. He read them twice. Then he smiled. Not the thin mathematical smile he wore for subordinates and allies. A genuine smile. The smile of a man watching his opponent make exactly the move he had predicted. The move he had spent 3 years engineering. The move that would open the one vulnerability that no amount of soldiers or gold or ruthless determination could protect. He's letting them in, Aldrich said to the empty room. He folded the documents and placed them inside his coat. Now we find out what he's willing to lose. 3 floors below the farmhouse, in a locked cellar that smelled of damp earth and iron, a man sat chained to a stone pillar. His uniform was torn. His face was swollen beyond recognition. Blood had dried in a mask across his features, cracking when he tried to move his jaw. He was a Veycroft courier. He had been carrying Caedric's sealed orders south when Aldrich's men intercepted him on the Ridge Road 4 hours ago. The courier had not talked. Not yet. But Aldrich Morcant was a patient man, and patience, applied correctly, could open anything. Locks. Fortresses. Men. The human architecture of loyalty and silence that people mistook for strength, but which was, in reality, just another structure waiting for the right pressure applied to the right point at the right time. He descended the stairs. The cellar door closed behind him, and inside Blackthorne Keep, standing on the balcony with the wind cutting through his coat, Caedric Veycroft felt something he could not explain, a pressure behind his sternum, a tightening at the base of his skull. The animal awareness that something, somewhere, had just gone wrong in a way he could not yet see, but could feel the way a sailor feels a storm that has not yet reached the horizon. He gripped the stone railing. His hand was trembling again. The courier's horse returned to Blackthorne Keep without its rider. Heron found the animal standing at the outer gate just after noon, its saddle twisted sideways, the leather satchel that should have contained Caedric's sealed orders slashed open and empty. The horse's flank was streaked with dried blood that was not its own. Its eyes rolled white when the stable hands approached, and it took 3 men to lead it inside the courtyard, its hooves clattering against wet stone in a stuttering rhythm that sounded like a warning delivered in a language no one wanted to translate. Heron brought the saddle to the war room. He set it on the table beside the campaign map without a word. Caedric looked at the slashed satchel. He looked at the blood on the leather. He did not ask what happened because the evidence answered every question that mattered, and the questions it did not answer were the kind that kept men awake at night, staring at ceilings in the dark. "Which courier?" he said. "Tobin Rask, 7 years of service, reliable, knew the Ridge Road better than anyone in the garrison. Find him. I've sent riders. Send more." Heron left. Caedric stood alone with the ruined saddle and felt the geometry of his situation shift the way a building shifts when the foundation cracks. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a settling. A redistribution of weight that changes every angle and every stress point and makes walls that seemed solid begin to show fractures in places no one thought to reinforce. His orders had been intercepted. Every document he had signed that morning. The grain releases. The troop redeployments. The village summit invitation. Aldrich had them. Aldrich knew exactly what Caedric was planning, which meant Aldrich knew exactly how to counter it, which meant every decision Caedric had made in the last 12 hours was not a strategy, but a confession. He had told his enemy precisely what mattered to him and precisely where he was vulnerable. Seraphine had asked him to open doors. He had opened them. And something had walked through. He found her in the East Wing library. She was sitting at a desk covered with financial ledgers, a cup of cold tea beside her elbow, her hair coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested she had been working for hours without pausing to notice. When he entered, she looked up and read his face in approximately 2 seconds. "What happened?" He told her. The courier, the satchel, the intercepted orders. He told her without inflection, without editorial, without any of the emotional texture that a less disciplined man might have allowed to color the delivery. He gave her the facts the way he gave Heron the facts. Clean, complete, uncontaminated by feeling. But Seraphine was not Heron. She heard what he was not saying the same way she heard what he was. And what he was not saying was that he had followed her advice, had taken the risk she recommended, had begun the process of dismantling 17 years of protective isolation, and the first result was a missing courier and a dead man's hands wrapped around every vulnerability he had just exposed. "This is not your fault," she said. "I didn't say it was." "You didn't have to. Your jaw is doing that thing it does when you're calculating how many walls you need to rebuild. We don't have time for this. We don't have time not to have this." She stood. "If you shut everything down now, if you pull back the grain shipments and cancel the summit and return to the fortress mentality that Aldrich spent 15 years building around you, he wins. Not in 6 weeks. Today. Right now. Because you will have proven that the moment anything goes wrong, you retreat to exactly the position he designed for you. A man is missing, Seraphine. A man who carried documents that map every strategic adjustment I've made in the last 12 hours. Aldrich has my playbook. He knows I'm reaching out to the villages. He knows I've pulled forces from the outer fortifications. He knows I'm exposed. Then stop being where he expects you to be. Caedric looked at her. The afternoon light from the library windows caught the angles of her face and illuminated the thin scar along her collarbone that he had noticed before, and that he now realized he had been thinking about at odd moments, wondering about its origin, wondering what had happened to the 14-year-old girl who had stood in a courtyard watching her world disappear and had decided to survive it through sheer, calculated refusal to break. "Meaning what?" he said. "Meaning Aldrich's plan depends on predicting you. Every contingency he's built assumes you will react the way he trained you to react. With isolation. With the ruthless mechanical efficiency he spent 15 years programming into you. He knows your moves because he choreographed them." She stepped closer. "So make moves he never taught you. You're asking me to improvise. I'm asking you to be unpredictable, which, for a man who has lived inside the same strategic framework for 17 years, might be the most dangerous thing you've ever done." The weight of what she was proposing settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not a change in tactics, a change in architecture, a fundamental restructuring of the operating system that had kept him alive since the night his father died. She was asking him to abandon the only version of himself that had ever worked, and she was asking him to do it while a man who knew him better than anyone alive was actively trying to destroy him. He should have said no. Every survival instinct he possessed, every lesson carved into his nervous system by 17 years of ruling through control and isolation, told him to seal the gates, double the guard, recall every shipment, and prepare for a siege the way he had always prepared for a siege. Alone, behind stone, with enough firepower to make the cost of attacking him higher than any rational enemy would pay. But Aldrich was not a rational enemy. Aldrich was a mirror. And you cannot defeat a mirror by doing what it already reflects. "What do you need?" Caedric said. Seraphine's eyes changed, not softened, focused, the way a blade focuses light when it reaches the exact angle necessary to cut. "Access to your intelligence network. Full access, not the filtered version Heron provides. I need to see every report, every intercepted communication, every piece of raw data your scouts have collected in the last 3 months." "Done." "I need authority to speak on behalf of House Veycroft to the tenant communities. Not as your wife, as your partner in governance." The word partner hit him in a place he did not know was still tender. He had never had a partner. He had never wanted one. Partnership implied shared authority, and shared authority implied trust, and trust was the door his father had opened for the men who loaded the crossbows. "Done," he said, and felt the fracture in his chest widen another degree. "And I need you to do something you have never done since the night your father died." "What?" "Trust someone who isn't you." He stood in the library with winter light falling across his shoulders and looked at this woman who had walked into his fortress 20 days ago and had systematically, methodically, relentlessly taken apart every defense he had ever built without ever raising her voice or drawing a weapon. "I don't know how to do that," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in 17 years. It came out of his mouth before the machinery of control could catch it and file it away in the locked compartment where he stored every piece of himself that felt like weakness. It simply escaped, like air from a cracked seal, like blood from a wound he did not know he had. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised them both. She reached out and placed her hand against the center of his chest, not gently, not tenderly, with the firm, deliberate pressure of someone checking a structural wall for soundness, her palm flat against his sternum, her fingers spread, feeling the heartbeat beneath the black fabric of his coat. "You're doing it right now," she said. He did not move. He did not breathe. He stood perfectly still with her hand against his chest and felt something he had no name for pulse through the fracture line like heat through cold stone, and for 3 seconds the war room and the intercepted orders and the missing courier and the dead chancellor who was not dead all ceased to exist, and there was only the pressure of her hand and the look in her green eyes, and the terrifying absolute vulnerability of allowing another human being to touch the place where he kept everything he could not afford to feel. Then he stepped back. "Get me those intelligence reports," he said. His voice was steady. His hand was not. She nodded. She left. He stood in the library and put his palm against the spot on his chest where her hand had been and felt the warmth fading from the fabric like evidence being destroyed. 3 days passed. 3 days during which Blackthorne Keep transformed into something it had never been. A collaborative operation. Seraphine established herself in the East Wing study and built what she called an intelligence synthesis, a cross-referenced analysis of every piece of data Caedric's network had collected, organized not by category, but by pattern. She identified 13 operatives who had been feeding Aldrich information from inside the Northern Territories. 3 were low-level clerks in trade offices. 4 were military supply officers. 2 were village administrators. And 4 were members of Caedric's own household staff. 4 people who had lived inside Blackthorne's walls, who had eaten at his table, who had walked the same corridors and breathed the same air, and carried his correspondence and maintained his weapons, and all the while had been sending reports to a dead man in a stone farmhouse 40 miles south. Caedric read the list of names in the war room at midnight. The fire was burning low. The castle was quiet in the way that large stone buildings become quiet after dark. A silence that felt inhabited rather than empty, as if the walls themselves were listening. He recognized every name on the list. Garrett Fenn, head steward, 14 years of service. The man who managed the household accounts, who knew every lock code, who had access to every room in the castle, including the private chambers where Caedric slept. Marin Yol, the head cook. The terrified woman Seraphine had shared tea with during her first week. Not terrified of Caedric, as it turned out. Terrified of what Aldrich's people would do to her family in the southern provinces if she stopped cooperating. Jorik Bren, master of the stables. The man who prepared Caedric's horses. Who controlled which animals were ready for deployment and which routes were available for riders carrying sensitive correspondence. The man who had almost certainly ensured that Tobin Rask rode the Ridge Road at exactly the time Aldrich's men were waiting. And Heron Voss. Caedric stared at the name. The letters did not change. They sat on the page with the quiet permanence of something that has always been true and has simply been waiting to be discovered. Heron Voss, captain of the guard, 11 years of service. The man Caedric had trusted with military operations, intelligence reports, and the physical security of the fortress itself. The man who stood at parade rest and called him Your Grace and carried out orders with the rigid discipline of a soldier who had built his identity on loyalty. The man who had been reporting to Aldrich Morcant for the last 3 years. Seraphine had found it in the communication patterns. Not direct correspondence. Heron was too careful for that. But a pattern of intelligence omissions that, when mapped against Aldrich's known operations, produced gaps so precise they could only be intentional. Reports that should have flagged suspicious activity along the southern border but didn't. Warnings about trade disruptions that arrived 12 hours after the disruptions had already taken effect. A systematic filtering of information designed to keep Caedric informed enough to feel in control while ensuring he never saw the full picture. Caedric set the list down on the table. He placed both hands flat on the wood surface and pressed down until his arms trembled. Not from weakness, from the physical effort of containing something that was trying to detonate inside his chest. Something he had no name for because he had spent 17 years refusing to acknowledge that it existed. Betrayal was supposed to be a concept, an abstract threat to be mitigated through systems and protocols and the careful elimination of dependency. Betrayal was supposed to be what happened to other men, to weaker men, to men like his father who left doors open and hearts exposed and trusted that the people around them were fundamentally decent. But the name on the paper was Heron Voss. And Heron Voss was the closest thing Caedric had allowed himself to have to a friend in 17 years. Not a friend. That word was too soft, too human. Heron was the fixed point, the reliable variable. The one component in the entire system that Caedric had never questioned because questioning Heron meant questioning his own judgment, and his own judgment was the last structural support holding the entire architecture of his life in place. Remove it, and everything fell. He picked up the list. He folded it once. He placed it inside his coat. Then he sat in the war room in the dark and thought about a man named Heron Voss, who had stood beside him through 11 years of governance and warfare and political brutality, who had received orders and delivered reports and maintained the perimeter of a fortress that was supposed to be impenetrable, and who had been quietly, patiently, invisibly hollowing it out from the inside like rot in the heart of a tree that still looks solid until the moment the wind comes and it collapses. Caedric thought about his father. Caedric Veycroft had trusted the men who killed him, had broken bread with them, had opened his home to them, had believed until the crossbow bolts hit his chest that loyalty was something you could earn through decency and fairness and the simple human act of treating people well. Caedric had learned from his father's death. He had sealed himself inside a system designed to make trust unnecessary. He had replaced human connection with hierarchical control. He had built Blackthorne Keep into a machine that operated on fear and efficiency and the absolute uncompromising principle that no one could be trusted, because trusting people was what got his father killed. And Heron Voss had walked right through it, not because the system failed, because the system had one design flaw that no amount of engineering could eliminate. Caedric was human, and human beings, no matter how ruthlessly they try to mechanize their lives, carry within them the need to believe that at least one person in the world is exactly what they appear to be. Heron had been that person, the reliable one, the steady one, the one who showed up and performed and never wavered and never demanded anything beyond the clear, contractual relationship of service and authority. And it was a performance. 11 years of performance. A role so meticulously maintained that it had become indistinguishable from reality. And the distinction between the performance and the betrayal had been invisible because Caedric needed it to be invisible. Because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting that his entire philosophy of survival was built on the same fragile foundation he had spent 17 years trying to eliminate: the need to trust someone, anyone, even if trusting them could kill you. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the war room and watched the fire die and felt the architecture of his life rearranging itself into shapes he did not recognize and could not control. At dawn, he summoned Heron. The captain arrived at the war room door at 6:15, freshly shaved, uniform pressed, boots polished to a mirror finish. He stood at parade rest and waited for orders with the patient discipline of a man who had been performing this exact routine for 11 years and saw no reason to vary it. "Close the door," Caedric said. Heron closed the door. Caedric was sitting at the campaign table. The map was spread before him. His hands were flat on the surface, fingers spread, perfectly still. No tremor. Nothing. The stillness that comes not from calm, but from the absolute concentration of a man who has compressed every emotion he possesses into a space so small that it has achieved a kind of critical mass and could detonate or disappear at any moment, and he does not yet know which. "How long?" Caedric said. Heron's face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation. The micro-expression of a man whose internal probability matrix has just been forced to reassign all its values. "Your Grace?" Don't do that. Don't put the uniform on. Don't give me the voice. Not now." Caedric's tone was quiet, conversational. The most dangerous register he possessed because it meant the machinery of control was operating at maximum capacity, and the thing it was containing was large enough to destroy the room. "How long have you been reporting to Aldrich?" The silence lasted 4 seconds. Heron's posture did not change. His hands remained clasped behind his back. His weight stayed evenly distributed across both feet, but the look in his eyes underwent a transformation that Caedric watched with the clinical attention of a man witnessing the exact moment a structure fails. The performance ended, not with a dramatic revelation, not with a confession or a justification or any of the theatrical gestures that lesser men use when they are caught. The performance ended the way a flame ends when the fuel is exhausted, quietly, completely, leaving behind something colder and more honest than anything the flame had illuminated. 3 years, Heron said, since his supposed death. Yes, he recruited you before he disappeared. He didn't recruit me. He showed me what was coming. He showed me the trajectory. Your isolation, the parliamentary erosion, the economic vulnerabilities. He showed me a mathematical projection of Blackthorne's collapse and gave me a choice between being inside the collapse or outside it. So you chose survival. I chose the version that let me keep breathing. The same choice you made 17 years ago. The same choice everyone in this castle makes every day they wake up under your roof. Caedric absorbed this. He absorbed it the way the stone walls of Blackthorne absorbed cannon fire. Without visible damage, without any external indication of the stress being distributed through internal structures that were never designed to handle this specific load. You stood beside me, he said. 11 years. You carried my orders. You commanded my garrison. You slept 30 feet from my chambers with a sword on your belt and access to every lock in this fortress. Yes. Were you ever going to kill me? No, that was never the plan. Aldrich doesn't want you dead. Dead dukes become martyrs. He wants you destroyed, politically, institutionally. He wants the name Veycroft to mean nothing. He wants to erase you from the power structure so completely that history forgets you existed. And you were comfortable with that. Comfortable is not a word that applies to any part of the last 3 years. Caedric stood. The chair did not scrape this time. He rose with the fluid control of a man whose body has been trained to move without wasted motion, without unnecessary sound, without any physical expression that could be interpreted as weakness or hesitation. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of Heron, close enough to see the pulse in the captain's throat, close enough to see the network of tiny scars across the left side of his jaw from the cavalry skirmish 7 years ago, close enough to see that the man's hands, still clasped behind his back, were trembling. "Did you know about my father?" Caedric said. The question dropped into the room like a blade into still water. Heron's face changed. For the first time in the conversation, something broke through the surface. Not guilt, not defiance. Something worse, something that looked like the particular anguish of a man who knows that the truth will cause more damage than any lie he could construct, but who has passed the point where lying is structurally possible. "No," Heron said. "I was not involved in your father's assassination. Aldrich handled that before my time." "Aldrich?" "Yes." The word detonated, not loudly, not visibly. The detonation was entirely internal, contained within the architecture of a man who had spent 17 years hunting the men who killed his father and executing them one by one, and believing with the absolute conviction of someone whose entire identity depends on the belief that justice had been served and the account had been closed and the dead had been properly avenged. Aldrich Morcant had killed his father, the chancellor, the advisor, the mentor, the man who had stood beside the teenage Caedric and helped him channel his grief into governance and his rage into power. The man who had guided every strategic decision for 15 years. The man who had taught him that weakness was a liability and trust was a weapon wielded by enemies, and love was the door through which death entered. The man who had killed Caedric Veycroft and then spent 15 years shaping the sun into a weapon aimed at himself. Caedric's vision narrowed. The room contracted around him. He could feel his heartbeat in his fingertips, in his throat, in the scar tissue along his temple where a blade had once opened his face to the bone. His breathing was controlled, deliberately controlled. The kind of forced regulation that combat veterans learn when the body's autonomous systems attempt to override rational thought with pure, unfiltered survival response. He wanted to kill Heron Voss. The impulse was not emotional, it was mechanical. A direct binary response to a threat variable that his nervous system had already categorized and processed and assigned a solution to before his conscious mind had finished registering the information. Kill the threat. Eliminate the variable. Remove the component that has failed and restore system integrity. But he did not kill Heron Voss. He did not kill him because Seraphine's voice was in his head saying, "Make moves he never taught you." And killing Heron was exactly the move Aldrich had taught him. Eliminate threats. Punish betrayal. Respond to every breach of loyalty with violence so immediate and so absolute that no one would ever consider betraying him again. That was the programming. That was the 17-year operating system that Aldrich himself had installed in the wreckage of a teenager's grief. And for the first time in his life, Caedric Veycroft chose not to run it. "You're going to tell me everything," he said. His voice was unrecognizable. Not loud, not violent. Something else entirely. The voice of a man who is rewriting his own code in real time while the system is still running. Every operative, every dead drop, every communication channel, every contingency plan Aldrich has built, every weakness in his network, every person he's corrupted, and every piece of leverage he's used to corrupt them. Heron stared at him. The trembling in his hands had intensified. Something in the captain's expression suggested that he had prepared himself for several possible outcomes of this conversation, and that none of them included the one currently taking place. "And then what?" Heron said. Caedric looked at the man who had betrayed him, the man who had served a dead chancellor, who had killed his father, the man who had been his fixed point for 11 years, and who was now standing in front of him as proof that every assumption he had ever made about loyalty, control, and the architecture of survival was fundamentally, catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. "And then," Caedric said, "you're going to help me burn it down." The debriefing lasted 9 hours. Seraphine sat in. She did not speak. She took notes with the mechanical focus of someone transcribing a surgical procedure, her pen moving across page after page while Heron dismantled 3 years of covert operations in clinical detail. The scale of Aldrich's network was staggering. 47 operatives embedded across the Northern Territories, 12 inside parliamentary institutions, 6 within the Crown's own military command structure, financial channels routing through 14 separate banking houses, communication networks using a cipher system that Aldrich had developed during his years as Chancellor, a system that Caedric's intelligence apparatus could not detect because it had been designed by the same man who built the intelligence apparatus. But the most devastating revelation was not the size of the network. It was its purpose. Aldrich was not planning a military coup. He was not planning an assassination. He was not planning any of the direct violent interventions that Caedric's fortress and army were designed to resist. He was planning a trial. A formal proceeding before the Crown and Parliament charging Duke Caedric Veycroft with tyranny, abuse of authority, and crimes against the population of the Northern Territories. A trial built on 17 years of documented evidence. Starved villages, terrorized servants, suppressed trade, militarized governance. Every brutal, efficient, ruthless decision Caedric had ever made, cataloged and organized into a legal case so comprehensive that no parliamentary body in the empire could ignore it. And the evidence was real. Every charge was true. That was the precision of it. That was the surgical elegance of Aldrich Morcant's revenge. He had not fabricated anything. He had simply waited while Caedric built his own prosecution, decision by decision, year by year, creating a record of authoritarian governance so thorough that the case practically wrote itself. The man who had killed the father had turned the son into the instrument of his own destruction. Caedric sat in the war room after Heron was escorted to a guarded chamber in the West Wing. Seraphine sat across from him. Between them, her notes covered the table like a map of devastation. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "He's right," Caedric said finally. "Every charge he's built, the starved villages, the terrorized staff, the suppressed trade, all of it. He's right." Seraphine looked at him. In the late afternoon light, her face held an expression he had never seen before. Not pity, not judgment. Something that existed in the narrow space between those two things. Something that acknowledged the damage without flinching from it. "Yes," she said. "He's right about what happened. He's wrong about why it can't change. A trial before Parliament will end House Veycroft. A trial before Parliament will end the version of House Veycroft that Aldrich created. The question is whether there's another version underneath it." Caedric leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Stone, ancient, cracked in places where centuries of settlement had stressed the mortar beyond its limits. Held together not by the strength of any individual stone, but by the weight of all of them pressing against each other in a structure that depended on mutual pressure to remain standing. "My father would have known what to do," he said. "Your father is dead. You're not. That's the only advantage that matters right now." He looked at her. This woman. This ruined noble's daughter who had arrived in a mud-streaked carriage with 2 trunks and a case of books, and who had proceeded to dismantle every assumption he held about strength and weakness and the distance between survival and living. "I have to become someone I don't know how to be," he said, "in 6 weeks, while fighting a man who knows me better than I know myself, using skills I never developed because the man who killed my father taught me they were weaknesses." "Yes, that's impossible." So is surviving the destruction of your entire family at 14 and rebuilding yourself into someone capable of standing in a room with the most dangerous man in the empire and telling him he's wrong about everything? She paused. And yet here I am. The wind outside Blackthorne shifted. It came from the north now, carrying the bite of approaching winter, and the salt tang of the sea, and the particular pressure that precedes storms large enough to reshape coastlines. Caedric Veycroft sat in the war room of his ancestors and felt the last wall fall. Not the walls of Blackthorne. Those were stone and iron and centuries old and built to withstand armies. The walls inside him, the ones he had constructed at 17 on the floor of this same room beside his father's cooling body. The walls that had kept him alive and kept him powerful and kept him ruling an empire through fear and efficiency and the absolute refusal to allow any human feeling to penetrate the machinery of control. Those walls fell. And what was left standing in the wreckage was not the Duke, not the Black Wolf of the North, not the most feared man in the empire. What was left was a man, damaged, furious, terrified in ways he did not have language for, but alive. Fully and completely alive for the first time in 17 years, feeling everything he had spent a lifetime refusing to feel and understanding with the nauseating clarity of someone stepping off a cliff, that the only way forward was through the fall. He reached across the table. He took Seraphine's hand. He held it, not gently, not tenderly, with the grip of a man holding on to the only solid thing in a world that was collapsing around him. She held back. And 40 miles south, in a stone farmhouse that smelled of damp earth and iron, Aldrich Morcant sealed the last document in his prosecution case and placed it inside a leather portfolio embossed with the Veycroft crest. He carried it to the window and looked north toward Blackthorne Keep, invisible beyond the hills and the gathering storm. 6 weeks, he said to no one. Then he descended to the cellar where the courier's body had already been removed. And he sat at the table where the chain still hung from the stone pillar, and he began writing the letter that would summon Parliament to session for the trial of Duke Caedric Veycroft. The ink was black, the handwriting was perfect, and somewhere inside Blackthorne Keep, holding the hand of a woman he had known for 23 days, Caedric Veycroft closed his eyes and let himself feel the full weight of what was coming, and understood that the man he had been could not survive it. Only the man he was becoming had a chance. And he did not yet know who that man was. The first village burned on a Tuesday. Caedric saw the smoke from the war room window before the riders arrived with the report. A black column rising from the valley floor 12 miles southeast of Blackthorne, thick and oily against the gray morning sky, leaning sideways in the coastal wind like a crooked finger pointing toward the fortress. He watched it for 40 seconds without moving, counting the density of the plume, estimating fuel load and wind dispersion and burn radius the way his military training had taught him. And then the analytical machinery stopped and the simple human reality of what he was seeing landed in his chest like a fist. Gorin Village, population 400, the first settlement he had sent grain to 3 weeks ago. The riders came through the gate at full gallop, their horses lathered and blowing, and the lead man nearly fell from his saddle dismounting because his left arm was hanging at an angle that arms are not designed to hang at, and his face was covered in soot and dried blood and the wild, shattered expression of someone who has seen something that his nervous system has not yet figured out how to process. 30 riders, the man gasped. No banners, no insignia. Hit before dawn, torched the granary first, then the commons, then the houses. Caedric descended to the courtyard. The cold hit him like a wall. He wore no coat. He had not bothered. The distance between knowing and acting had collapsed to nothing inside his skull, and the detour required to dress for weather registered as an unacceptable waste of seconds. Casualties. 7 dead, 20 wounded. Most got out through the north field, but the granary workers were trapped. The rider's voice cracked. 3 of them were children, Your Grace. Families that moved into the granary loft last week because the grain stores made it warmer than their homes. Caedric's jaw tightened. A micro-movement. Invisible to anyone who had not spent years studying his face for the hairline fractures between control and what lived beneath it. But Seraphine, who had appeared on the courtyard steps behind him, saw it. She saw the muscle flex along the hinge of his jaw, and the momentary dilation of his pupils, and the way his fingers curled inward against his palms, and she understood that what was happening inside Caedric Veycroft at this moment was not anger. It was something older than anger, something that lived in the foundation beneath every other emotion he possessed. The 17-year-old boy kneeling beside his father's body was alive inside this man, and the boy was screaming, and the man was holding him down with both hands, while the machinery of command continued to operate on the surface. "Which direction did the riders withdraw?" Caedric said. "South, toward the mountain passes." "Organized withdrawal or scatter pattern?" "Organized. Column formation." They knew the terrain. Caedric turned to Seraphine. Their eyes met. In the gray courtyard light, with smoke visible on the horizon and the sounds of wounded horses and shouting men filling the air around them, they held a conversation that required no words. He saw the recognition in her face. She saw the calculation in his. Aldrich had moved first, not against Blackthorne, against the villages, against the exact targets Caedric had reached out to, against the precise communities where his grain shipments and governance invitations had created the fragile beginnings of trust between the fortress and the people it was supposed to protect. The message was surgical. "You opened a door. I walked through it. Everything you try to build, I will burn. Everyone you try to protect, I will hurt. Not because they matter to me, but because they are beginning to matter to you, and anything that matters to you is a target I can use." Seraphine stepped forward. "How many villages received grain shipments in the last 3 weeks?" Caedric did not look at her. He was staring south toward the smoke, and his body had gone still in that way she had learned to recognize. The blade's stillness, the compression that preceded either extraordinary violence or extraordinary control, and the difference between the two was measured in fractions of a second, and decisions made in parts of the brain that do not consult reason before they act. 11, he said. "Then 11 villages are targets." "Yes." "You can't garrison all of them. You don't have the men." "No." "So what do you do?" He turned. The look on his face was something she had never seen. Not the granite control, not the cold efficiency, something rawer. Something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, and realizing that the ground behind him is burning, and the only direction left is down, and the only question that matters is whether you fall or you jump, because the destination is the same, but the difference between falling and jumping is the difference between a victim and a choice. "I stop defending," he said. "I attack." The War Council convened in the Great Hall at noon. Caedric had never held a War Council. He had held briefings. He had issued orders. He had sat alone in the war room and moved pieces across the campaign map and made decisions that affected thousands of lives without consulting anyone, because consultation implied uncertainty, and uncertainty implied weakness, and weakness, in the operating system Aldrich had installed in him 17 years ago, was the precursor to death. But the man who walked into the Great Hall at noon was running new code. 12 people sat around the table. Seraphine, the garrison commanders who remained loyal after Heron's network was dismantled. 2 village leaders from communities closest to Blackthorne who had ridden through the night after the burning of Gorin. And Heron Voss himself, seated at the far end of the table with his wrists in iron shackles and 2 armed guards behind his chair. The room was tense in the way that rooms become tense when the people inside them understand that the decisions made in the next few hours will determine whether they live or die. The village leaders looked terrified. The garrison commanders looked grim. Heron looked at the table surface and did not raise his eyes. Caedric stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. Sitting implied permanence. He wanted everyone in this room to understand that what was about to happen would happen quickly, and that hesitation was not available. Aldrich burned Gorin village this morning. 7 dead, including 3 children. He will burn every settlement I've contacted unless we act in the next 48 hours. He laid the campaign map on the table. His network has 47 operatives across the territories. We've identified 39 of them from Captain Voss's debriefing. His military force is limited. He doesn't have an army. He has raiding parties, fast, mobile, designed to strike soft targets and disappear before a conventional force can respond. He looked at Heron. "How many fighters does he have?" Heron raised his eyes. The shackles clinked against the table edge when he shifted his hands. 200, maybe 220. Mercenaries, mostly, recruited from the southern border campaigns, Experienced, well-paid, but they're contractors. They fight for gold, not loyalty. Where are they based? Rotational camps. Never the same location twice. He moves them through the mountain passes using a relay system. 3 staging points between here and the southern border. Show me. Heron leaned forward and placed 3 fingers on the map. The war room went silent as the man who had betrayed Caedric for 3 years began drawing the architecture of that betrayal across the campaign table in precise, clinical detail. One of the village leaders, an older man with calloused hands and the weathered face of someone who had spent 50 years working land that barely yielded enough to survive, watched the exchange with an expression of complete bewilderment. A duke consulting a trader. A fortress opening its strategy to farmers. The entire hierarchical structure of the Northern Territories, the rigid, immovable caste system that had governed this region for generations, was being dismantled in real time by a man who looked like he was tearing off his own skin and building something new from the raw tissue underneath. "You're asking him for help," the village leader said. "The man who sold you out." Caedric looked at him. "Yes." "Why?" "Because he knows things I need to know, and because I am finished making decisions based on what feels satisfying instead of what works." The old man held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way men nod when they recognize something they have not seen in a long time and had stopped believing they would ever see again. "Your father used to talk like that," he said. Caedric absorbed the words. He did not respond to them, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders. A fraction of an inch. A release of tension so subtle that only Seraphine noticed it. And she noticed it because she had spent the last 23 days learning to read this man the way astronomers learn to read the night sky. By the movement of things so distant and so faint that most people never see them at all. The plan came together in 3 hours. It was not a military plan. Caedric had spent 17 years building military plans, and Aldrich had spent 15 of those years helping him, which meant every military strategy Caedric could devise was a strategy Aldrich had already anticipated and countered. This was something else. Seraphine called it a political offensive. Caedric called it a gamble. What it actually was, stripped of terminology and dressed in plain language, was a bet that the people Aldrich had spent 3 years weaponizing against the Duke could be turned into the Duke's most powerful asset if they were given a reason to fight for him instead of against him. The grain shipments had been a start. The village summit had been an intention, but an intention burned to ash in Gorin village. And what was needed now was not a gesture but a commitment so total and so irreversible that every tenant farmer, every merchant, every laborer in the Northern Territories would understand that House Veycroft was no longer a boot on their neck but a shield at their back. Caedric wrote the declaration himself. Not a speech, not a proclamation, a legal document, signed and sealed with the Veycroft crest, a binding transfer of governance rights that gave every tenant community in the Northern Territories autonomous control over their local affairs, taxation, trade, and militia organization while maintaining their voluntary alliance with Blackthorne Keep. Voluntary. The word tasted like broken glass in his mouth. Voluntary meant they could leave. Voluntary meant his authority existed only because people chose to grant it, not because he forced it upon them. Voluntary meant that the fortress on the cliff, with its armies and its gold and its centuries of accumulated power, was worth exactly as much as the trust of the people it was supposed to serve. He signed it. His hand did not shake. That surprised him more than anything else. Riders carried the declaration to every village in the Northern Territories. Simultaneously, Seraphine dispatched her own network of contacts, relationships she had built in 23 days of walking through lower districts and sitting in kitchens and speaking to people no noble had acknowledged in years, to spread the word through channels that no official messenger could access. The human channels, the whispered conversations, the kitchen tables and market stalls and field boundaries where real opinion is formed and real loyalty is decided. The response came faster than anyone expected. Within 36 hours, militia companies began forming in 11 villages. Not professional soldiers, farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters. Men and women who had never held a weapon in anger, but who understood with the clarity of people who have survived at the margins of power that the Duke's declaration was either the beginning of something worth fighting for or the last trick of a dying dynasty, and either way, the alternative was Aldrich Morcant and the burning of everything they had. They chose to fight. Not for the Duke, not for House Veycroft, not for the abstract concept of feudal loyalty that had governed their lives for generations. They chose to fight because a woman in velvet and diamonds had sat in their kitchens and looked them in the eye and spoken to them like human beings, and because the man she served had signed a document that said their lives mattered, and because sometimes the difference between tyranny and leadership is nothing more than a piece of paper and the willingness to be held accountable for what it says. Aldrich struck again on the fourth night. This time it was not a village. It was the supply route between Blackthorne and the eastern settlements. 20 wagons loaded with winter provisions, ambushed in the narrow defile below Kessler Ridge by 40 mounted fighters who materialized from the tree line like something summoned from the dark. But the wagons were not undefended. 2 village militia companies, 60 men and women armed with hunting bows and farming tools, and the desperate courage of people protecting their own survival, were positioned on the ridgeline above the defile. They opened fire into the ambush column from elevated positions, and the mercenaries, trained to fight professional soldiers in open terrain, found themselves engaged by an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not intimidate because these were not soldiers following orders. These were people defending their food. The ambush collapsed in 11 minutes. 14 mercenaries killed, 23 captured, 3 wagons damaged but recoverable. The militia lost 2 dead and 7 wounded, and when the survivors marched the captured mercenaries back to Blackthorne Keep, they arrived at the gates with a quiet, exhausted pride that changed the atmosphere of the fortress more profoundly than any military victory could have. Caedric met them in the courtyard. He stood in the cold and looked at the faces of the people who had fought for him. Farmers with blood on their hands, a blacksmith with a crossbow bolt lodged in the meat of her shoulder, refusing treatment until her companions were seen to first. An old man, the same village leader from the war council, standing at the front of the column with a captured mercenary banner in his fist and an expression on his weathered face that said something words could not carry. Caedric looked at these people and felt something move inside his chest that was not the fracture widening. It was the fracture closing. Not healing, closing. The way broken bone knits back together under pressure, growing stronger at the breakpoint than the surrounding tissue, because the body, when it repairs itself, reinforces the damage with something denser and more resilient than what was there before. He was becoming something. He did not yet have a name for it. It was not his father's warmth. It was not Aldrich's cold machinery. It was something that existed in the space between those two things, forged from the wreckage of both, and it felt dangerous and unfamiliar and alive in a way that nothing in his life had felt alive since the night he was 17 and the world as he knew it ended on the floor of a war room. He thanked them, not formally, not with the practiced eloquence of a nobleman addressing his subjects. He stood in the courtyard and looked at them and said, "You did not have to do this." The blacksmith with the bolt in her shoulder looked at him with eyes that were bright with pain and something else. "Yeah, we did," she said. That was all. It was enough. The 5th week arrived like a held breath. Aldrich's trial summons had been dispatched. Parliamentary session was scheduled in 11 days. The formal charges against Duke Caedric Veycroft would be read before the assembled lords of the empire, and the evidence, 17 years of documented tyranny, compiled by the most meticulous political strategist the Northern Territories had ever produced, would be presented in a proceeding designed to strip House Veycroft of its titles, its lands, its military authority, and its right to exist. Caedric knew the evidence was real. He knew the charges were accurate. He knew that standing before Parliament and attempting to defend 17 years of authoritarian governance was not a strategy but a form of institutional surrender, because the facts were not on his side and the facts were the only thing that mattered in a legal proceeding. So he did something Aldrich did not expect. He sent a message to Parliament accepting every charge, not contesting, not defending, accepting. A formal document, signed and sealed, acknowledging that the governance of the Northern Territories under Duke Caedric Veycroft had caused documented harm to its population, accompanied by the declaration of autonomous governance he had already distributed, accompanied by testimony from village leaders confirming the recent reforms, accompanied by financial records showing the redistribution of wealth and resources, and accompanied by a single request that the trial proceed not as a prosecution but as a hearing, an open forum in which the people of the Northern Territories could speak for themselves about what had happened, what was changing, and what they wanted for their future. The request was unprecedented. No duke in the history of the empire had ever voluntarily submitted to the judgment of his own people. The political implications were seismic. If Parliament agreed, the hearing would establish a precedent that noble authority existed at the consent of the governed, a principle so radical that it threatened the foundational structure of every aristocratic house in the empire. Aldrich would oppose it. Every noble house with something to hide would oppose it. The crown itself might oppose it, because a precedent that applied to Veycroft today could apply to the throne tomorrow. But Caedric had calculated something that Aldrich had not. The people were already talking: the village militias, the grain shipments, the autonomous governance declaration, the blacksmith with the crossbow bolt in her shoulder. The story was spreading through the Northern Territories and beyond, carried by the same human channels that Seraphine had activated. The kitchen tables and market stalls and whispered conversations that no intelligence network could monitor and no political strategist could control. The story of a duke who had been a tyrant and was trying to become something else. Not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because 3 children had died in a burning granary and a woman had placed her hand against his chest and a man he trusted had betrayed him. And the version of himself that could survive all of that without changing was a version he no longer wanted to be. Parliament would not rule on evidence alone. Parliament would rule on pressure. And pressure, in a system built on aristocratic privilege, comes from the one force that aristocrats fear more than any army or treasury: the voice of the people they govern. Aldrich had built a machine to destroy a tyrant. He had not built a machine to destroy a man willing to stand before his own people and say, "I was wrong." On the night before the parliamentary hearing, Caedric stood on the balcony of Blackthorne Keep and looked out at the Northern Territories spread beneath him in the darkness. Fires were burning in the villages, not the fires of destruction, the fires of preparation. Communities gathering, militia companies assembling, delegations organizing for the journey to the capital where their duke would stand before the most powerful institution in the empire and submit himself to their judgment. Seraphine found him there. She stood beside him in the wind and looked at the same fires and said nothing for a long time. "Are you afraid?" she said finally. He thought about the question, really thought about it. Not the reflexive denial that his old programming would have generated. Not the automatic suppression of vulnerability that had governed every response he had given for 17 years. He actually considered the question as a man considers something that matters. "Yes," he said, "I am afraid that I waited too long, that the damage I did is too deep, that the people coming to that hearing will look at me and see 17 years of cruelty and nothing else. They might. I know. And if they do, if Parliament strips your title and your lands and everything your family built over centuries, if Aldrich wins?" Caedric looked at her. In the darkness, with firelight from the villages reflected in the low clouds above them, her face was half illuminated and half shadow, and she looked like what she was. A woman who had survived the destruction of everything she knew and had rebuilt herself from the wreckage without losing the part of herself that was capable of standing on a cold balcony and asking hard questions of a man who needed to hear them. "Then I will have lost everything," he said, "and I will have deserved it, and I will still be standing here, and you will still be beside me, and that will have to be enough." She took his hand. He held it. Below them, the fires burned. And somewhere on the road to the capital, in a private carriage escorted by armed riders bearing no insignia, Aldrich Morcant reviewed his prosecution documents one final time and felt for the first time in 3 years something he could not immediately identify. It took him several minutes to recognize it. It was doubt. Not about his evidence. The evidence was flawless. Not about his strategy. The strategy was sound. Not about the outcome, which every rational analysis still projected overwhelmingly in his favor. The doubt was about the man. The Caedric Veycroft, who existed in Aldrich's models, in his projections, in the 3 years of meticulous planning that had brought them to this moment, was a man who responded to threat with force, to betrayal with violence, to vulnerability with the immediate and total reconstruction of defensive walls. The man who had accepted every charge. who had signed autonomous governance rights over to farmers and blacksmiths, who had invited his own people to judge him before Parliament. That man was not in the model. That man was something Aldrich had not built, had not anticipated, had not accounted for. And as his carriage rolled through the darkness toward a hearing that would determine the fate of the most powerful duchy in the empire, Aldrich Morcant stared at his perfect evidence and his perfect strategy and his perfect plan and felt the cold, precise machinery of his mind encounter something it had no algorithm for. A man who had chosen to change. The carriage wheels turned, the road stretched ahead, and the hearing that would decide everything was 12 hours away. The parliamentary chamber smelled like old wood and older ambition. Caedric stood outside the double oak doors at 7 in the morning, an hour before the hearing was scheduled to begin, and listened to the building breathe. The capital's parliamentary hall was a monument to the empire's belief in its own permanence. Marble columns 40 feet high, vaulted ceilings painted with scenes of historical triumph that conveniently omitted the suffering those triumphs required. Rows of polished benches arranged in a semicircle around a central floor where, for 3 centuries, the powerful had gathered to adjudicate the fate of the powerless while convincing themselves the process was justice. He wore black. He had considered wearing something else. Seraphine had suggested it gently the night before. A different color might signal change, might communicate to the assembled lords that the man standing before them was not the same man they had voted to strip of authority 6 weeks ago. He had looked at her and said, "I am the same man. I'm a different version of the same man. And the difference matters more if it shows through the same surface." She had not argued. Now he stood in the corridor and pressed his palm flat against the oak door and felt the grain of the wood beneath his fingers and thought about what waited on the other side. 230 parliamentary lords, the crown's representative. A gallery packed with observers from every noble house in the empire. And Aldrich Morcant seated somewhere inside, holding 17 years of evidence and the absolute conviction that the man he had created could not escape the architecture he had designed. Footsteps behind him. Seraphine. She wore dark green. Simple. No jewelry except the thin gold chain. Her hair was pulled back and her face held the composed intensity of someone who is prepared for battle and understands that the preparation is finished and the only thing left is the act itself. "The village delegations are inside," she said. 47 representatives from 12 communities. They arrived before dawn. How do they look? Terrified, determined. The blacksmith from the supply convoy is in the front row. She's still wearing the sling from her shoulder wound. Caedric closed his eyes for a moment. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, he saw the courtyard at Blackthorne. The militia returning with captured mercenaries. The old village leader holding a banner. The blacksmith refusing treatment. "Yeah, we did." He opened his eyes. "Let's go." The doors opened. The sound hit him first. 200 voices falling silent in a wave that started at the back of the chamber and rolled forward like a tide retreating from shore. By the time Caedric reached the central floor, the room was absolutely quiet. The kind of silence that has texture, that has weight. The silence of 200 powerful men watching something they do not understand approach them across a marble floor. He saw Aldrich immediately. 3rd row, right side. Seated among the parliamentary lords with the practiced ease of a man who belonged there, who had always belonged there, who understood the rhythms and protocols of this chamber the way a musician understands the instrument they have played for decades. He was thinner than Caedric remembered, sharper. The years of exile had stripped whatever softness might have once existed in his features and left behind something that looked carved from the same cold stone as the columns around them. Their eyes met. Aldrich's expression did not change, but Caedric saw something flicker behind those pale gray eyes. The same thing Caedric had felt when he read Heron's name on the betrayal list. Recognition. The particular shock of encountering something familiar that has become fundamentally unfamiliar. Like returning to a room you once knew and finding the furniture rearranged by someone who understands the space better than you do. Caedric held the look for 3 seconds. Then he turned to the speaker's bench and waited. The speaker, a gaunt man named Lord Callister, whose family had held the parliamentary gavel for 4 generations, opened the proceedings with the ritualized formality that the institution demanded. The charges were read: tyrannical governance, suppression of trade, militarization of civilian populations, deliberate impoverishment of tenant communities, abuse of hereditary authority. Each charge landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into water. The lords shifted in their seats. Some looked at Caedric with open contempt. Some looked at him with the carefully neutral expressions of men calculating which outcome would best serve their own interests. A few, a very few, looked at him with something that might have been curiosity. When the charges were finished, the speaker asked the Duke how he wished to plead. Caedric stepped forward. "I accept every charge," he said. The chamber erupted. Not in violence, in noise. The particular noise of 200 men who have been trained since birth to expect denial, deflection, and the elaborate legal theater of aristocratic self-defense, and who have instead received something that their institutional programming has no category for: honesty. The speaker called for order. It took 4 minutes. "The Duke accepts the charges," Lord Callister repeated, as if saying it again might change what it meant. "Does the Duke wish to offer testimony in mitigation?" "No," Caedric said. "I wish to offer testimony and explanation, not to excuse what I did, to explain what made me capable of doing it, and to present evidence that the conditions described in these charges are being changed, not by my authority alone, but by the collective decision of the communities I governed." He paused. "And I wish to call the people of the Northern Territories to speak for themselves, not on my behalf, on their own." He turned and looked directly at Aldrich. "Because the man who compiled these charges did not do so out of concern for my people. He did it to destroy me. And the difference between justice and revenge is whether the people who were harmed get to decide the outcome." Aldrich's face remained perfectly composed, but his left hand, resting on the bench beside him, pressed flat against the wood with enough force to whiten the knuckles, a micro-expression of pressure, the physical manifestation of a mind encountering a variable it had not modeled. The speaker deliberated with the Parliamentary Council for 12 minutes. When he returned, the decision was unprecedented but legally permissible under an ancient procedural clause that allowed affected populations to testify in governance hearings. The village delegations were called to the floor. They came forward in groups. Farmers in their best clothes, which were still the clothes of people who worked the land for a living. The blacksmith with her arm in a sling. The old village leader with hands so calloused they looked like they were made of the same material as the fields he worked. They spoke. Not eloquently, not with the polished rhetoric of trained orators. They spoke the way people speak when they have been given a chance to say something true in a room where truth has historically been a liability. The old village leader stood on the central floor and looked at the rows of lords in their fine clothes and their ancestral seats and said, "I've lived under Veycroft rule for 53 years. Under the old Duke, we ate. Under this Duke, we starved. That's the truth of it, and there's no making it pretty." He paused. "But 3 weeks ago, grain came. Not because we asked, because someone inside that fortress decided we mattered enough to feed. And a week after that, a piece of paper came that said we could govern our own villages, tax our own trade, form our own militia. In 53 years, no duke ever gave us that, not even the good one." He looked at Caedric. "I don't forgive what happened. My neighbor's daughter died in that granary fire, 8 years old. I held her mother while she screamed. That doesn't go away because a duke signs a paper." His voice cracked. He steadied it. "But I know the difference between a man who hurts people because he doesn't care and a man who hurt people because he forgot how to care and is trying to remember. And I know the difference between someone asking for my judgment and someone pretending my judgment matters. This man is asking, and I've been alive long enough to know that asking is harder than ordering." The chamber was silent. The blacksmith spoke next. She stood with her wounded arm against her body and her good hand gripping the testimony rail, and she told the assembled lords about the supply convoy ambush, about farmers with hunting bows standing on a ridgeline in the dark, fighting mercenaries who outweighed them in training and equipment and everything except the willingness to die for something that mattered. "We didn't fight for the Duke," she said. "We fought for our grain, for our children's winter, for the right to eat without asking permission from men who've never been hungry." She looked around the chamber. "Most of you have never been hungry. Most of you have never watched your kid go to sleep crying because there's nothing to put in their stomach. So when you sit up there and judge what happened in the North, remember that. Remember that you're judging from full bellies." One by one, they spoke. 12 communities, 47 voices, each one carrying the specific gravity of lived experience, the weight that no legal argument and no compiled evidence can match, because it comes from the body rather than the mind, from the hands that work the soil and the backs that carry the loads, and the eyes that watch children grow in conditions that no parliamentary lord has ever been required to endure. Caedric listened to every word. He stood on the central floor and received their testimony like a man receiving blows. Each account of hunger, each description of fear, each story of what it meant to live under the authority of a man who had decided that human warmth was a strategic liability. He absorbed it. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He stood and listened and felt every word carve itself into the tissue of his understanding like a blade etching a record into stone. This was the cost. Not the political cost, not the legal cost, the human cost. Measured in hungry children and terrified servants in villages that went dark in winter because the man on the cliff had decided that darkness was safer than light. He had done this. Not Aldrich, not the system, not the inheritance of trauma that had shaped him after his father's death. He had done this. Every decision, every order, every cold calculation that had treated human suffering as an acceptable operational parameter, his hands, his name, his responsibility. And standing in that chamber, hearing the voices of the people he had failed, Caedric understood something that 17 years of isolation had made impossible to see. Strength was not the capacity to endure without changing. Strength was the capacity to hear the truth about what you had become, and to choose, in the wreckage of that hearing, to become something else. Not because it was easy, not because it erased the damage, but because the alternative was to stand in a room full of people you had harmed and pretend that their pain did not matter, and that pretense was the actual weakness. That pretense was the real cowardice. The fortress walls and the military discipline and the ruthless efficiency were not strength. They were the elaborate, exhausting, ultimately futile machinery of a man too afraid to feel what he had done. Aldrich rose to speak. He stood on the central floor with his leather portfolio of evidence and his perfect posture and his pale gray eyes, and he began his prosecution with the systematic precision of a man who had spent 3 years building a case so comprehensive that no testimony, however moving, could dismantle it. He was brilliant. Even Caedric, watching with the detached clarity of someone who has passed beyond fear into something quieter, recognized the artistry. Aldrich laid out 17 years of governance failures with the meticulous attention of an architect presenting blueprints, dates, numbers, documents, correspondence. A paper trail so detailed and so damning that the emotional testimony of 47 village representatives began to feel like noise against the signal of institutional evidence. The lords listened. Some nodded. The calculation was visible on their faces. Emotion versus evidence, testimony versus documentation, the raw, uncomfortable honesty of farmers versus the clean, comfortable precision of legal argument. Aldrich was winning. Caedric could feel it. The room shifting, the balance tipping, the lords retreating from the discomfort of human testimony into the familiar safety of procedural analysis. This was their world. Documents and precedents, and the careful adjudication of power through mechanisms designed to keep the powerful comfortable. Aldrich knew this world. He had been born in it. He was playing the instrument he understood. Then Caedric did the last thing anyone expected. He asked to question Aldrich directly. The speaker hesitated. Direct questioning between parties was technically permissible but almost never invoked because it removed the protective buffer of procedural formality and created conditions for exactly the kind of raw, uncontrolled confrontation that parliamentary protocol was designed to prevent. "Granted," Lord Callister said. Caedric stepped to the center of the floor. Aldrich stood 6 feet from him, close enough to see the pulse in each other's throats, close enough to read the micro-expressions that formal distance was designed to obscure. "You served my father," Caedric said. "I did." "For how long?" 12 years. And during those 12 years, you were present at every strategic council, every military briefing, every governance meeting. I was. You knew his schedule, his routines, his security protocols, the names and positions of every guard assigned to his personal protection. Aldrich's composure held, but the stillness that settled over his body was the stillness of a man who has recognized the trajectory of a question and cannot alter its path. I did. My father was killed by 3 crossbow bolts in a room protected by guards you helped select, on a night when you knew he would be working alone, during a window of vulnerability in the security rotation that only someone with your level of access could have identified. The chamber went absolutely silent. You killed my father, Caedric said. Or you arranged his killing, and then you stood beside his 17-year-old son and channeled that son's grief into a governing philosophy so brutal that it systematically destroyed everything his father had built. You turned me into the weapon, you pointed me at my own people, and then, when the damage was sufficient, you compiled the evidence of that damage and brought it here to finish the job. Aldrich did not blink. That is a serious accusation, he said. Do you have evidence? I have testimony from Captain Heron Voss, who served as your operative inside Blackthorne for 3 years, and who has provided detailed accounts of your network, your methods, and your stated objectives, including the explicit acknowledgement that you orchestrated the assassination of Duke Caedric Veycroft. The noise in the chamber was not noise. It was the sound of a political institution experiencing a structural failure, 200 men talking at once, the speaker hammering his gavel, guards moving toward the exits, and at the center of it all, 2 men standing 6 feet apart on a marble floor, looking at each other with the perfect clarity of people who have finally stopped pretending. Aldrich's mask did not crack, but the eyes behind it underwent a change that Caedric watched with the attention of a man who has waited 17 years for this exact moment. You have no proof, Aldrich said quietly, beneath the noise. I have a man who worked for you, who knows your cipher system, who knows your operational structure, who can name every agent you placed inside my household and every payment you made to compromised officials. The proof exists, Aldrich. You built it yourself. You just never expected anyone to read it from the other direction. The gavel hammered. Order was restored. The speaker called for a formal investigation into the assassination charges. Aldrich was confined to the chamber under parliamentary guard pending review of the evidence. The hearing adjourned. Caedric walked out of the parliamentary chamber into cold afternoon light. The capital's central square was packed with people. Word had spread. Not just the noble observers and political operatives who populated the galleries, but ordinary citizens who had heard that something unprecedented was happening inside the marble walls, that a duke had accepted his own charges, that farmers had testified before lords, that the most powerful man in the northern territories had stood on the chamber floor and admitted he was wrong. Seraphine was waiting on the steps. He stopped in front of her. The crowd noise washed over them like weather, distant, irrelevant, background static against the signal of 2 people looking at each other after surviving something that should have destroyed them both. It's not over, he said. No, but the part that was killing you is. He looked at her. Green eyes in cold light, the thin gold chain catching the last of the afternoon sun, the scar along her collarbone visible above the neckline of her dress. Every detail vivid in the way that details become vivid when the body finally releases the sustained tension it has been carrying and the senses, no longer filtered through the machinery of survival, receive the world directly. I'm going to say something, he said, and I need you to understand that I have never said it to anyone and that saying it feels approximately equivalent to stepping off the balcony at Blackthorne without knowing if the ground will hold. Then say it. You saved my life. Not the political version, not the institutional version, the actual life, the one that was disappearing inside the machinery I built to protect it. He paused. And I am in love with you in a way that I do not fully understand and cannot control, and that violates every principle I have operated under for 17 years. And I am telling you this on the steps of Parliament with a crowd of strangers watching because I am finished hiding the things that matter inside rooms where no one can see them. Seraphine looked at him for a long time. Then she placed her hand against the center of his chest, the same gesture she had made in the library at Blackthorne, palm flat against his sternum, fingers spread, feeling the heartbeat beneath the black fabric. Your heart rate is elevated, she said, significantly. Good. She pressed her palm harder. That means it's working. The investigation into Aldrich Morcant lasted 3 weeks. Heron Voss testified for 4 days. The cipher system was decoded. The financial channels were traced. The network of 47 operatives was documented and dismantled. And the evidence linking Aldrich to the assassination of Duke Caedric Veycroft, while circumstantial in some respects and direct in others, was sufficient for the parliamentary tribunal to issue a formal finding of culpability. Aldrich did not confess. He did not defend himself. He sat in the hearing chamber with perfect posture and pale gray eyes and watched his life's work unravel with the clinical detachment of a man observing an experiment that has produced an unexpected result. When the verdict was read, he looked at Caedric across the chamber and held his gaze for a long time. "You were my best work," Aldrich said, "and my worst mistake. Your mistake was believing that the thing you built was all I was. Perhaps." Aldrich tilted his head. "Or perhaps my mistake was teaching you so well that you eventually learned how to stop being my student." He was escorted from the chamber. Caedric never saw him again. The return to Blackthorne took 5 days. They traveled slowly, not because the roads demanded it, but because Caedric, for the first time in 17 years, was in no hurry to reach a destination. He rode beside Seraphine through the mountain passes as autumn turned the northern forests to copper and gold. They stopped in villages along the route and were met not with the lowered eyes and terrified silence that had characterized every interaction between the Duke and his people for nearly 2 decades, but with something else, something cautious and uncertain and new, something that was not trust, not yet, but the willingness to consider that trust might eventually be possible. In one village, a woman brought her children to the road to see the Duke pass. The oldest child, a girl of maybe 9, held a bunch of wildflowers that were already wilting in the autumn cold. She extended them toward Caedric with the trembling hand of a child who has been told that the man on the horse is dangerous, but who has also been told that dangerous men sometimes change. Caedric dismounted. He knelt on the road. He took the flowers. "Thank you," he said. The girl looked at him with enormous eyes. "My mam says you sent the grain that kept us fed." "Your mam is right. She also says you should have sent it sooner." Caedric looked at the girl, 9 years old, clear-eyed, honest in the way that children are honest before the world teaches them that honesty is expensive. "Your mam is right about that too," he said. He remounted and rode on. He carried the wilting flowers for the rest of the journey. He did not explain why. Blackthorne Keep appeared on the headland as they crested the final ridge, its towers dark against a sky that was, for once, not threatening rain. The fortress looked the same, stone and iron and centuries of accumulated authority, standing on the cliff edge as it had stood for generations, impervious to weather and warfare and the passage of time. But as Caedric rode through the outer gates, he noticed things he had never noticed before. Or rather, things he had noticed and dismissed because the operating system he had been running classified them as irrelevant data. The way the afternoon light caught the moss growing between the courtyard stones, turning the gray surface faintly green. The sound of the sea below the cliffs, not the violent crashing he usually registered, but the deeper, slower rhythm beneath it. The patient pulse of water against rock that had been going on for millennia and would continue long after the fortress and everyone in it had returned to dust. The smell of bread from the kitchen. The distant sound of someone laughing in the servants' quarters. Laughing. In Blackthorne Keep. He dismounted in the courtyard and stood for a moment, holding the reins, looking up at the fortress he had ruled for 17 years and seeing it, truly seeing it, for the first time. It was not a weapon. It was not a machine. It was a home. A damaged, neglected, profoundly wounded home that had been designed by the people who built it to shelter the people who lived in it, and that had been converted, by grief and fear and the systematic elimination of everything human, into something that served no purpose except the perpetuation of one man's refusal to feel. He had done that, and now he would undo it. Not quickly, not easily. Not completely, perhaps, because some damage writes itself into the foundation and becomes part of the structure, and the best you can do is acknowledge it and build around it, and make sure the parts you add are stronger than the parts that broke. Seraphine dismounted beside him. "Home," she said. He looked at her. "Is it? It can be a tubby if you let it." Tut. He handed the reins to a stable hand, Then he walked to the balcony overlooking the sea. The water was calm. Late afternoon sun turned the surface to hammered bronze. The cliffs below were dark with moisture, and the seabirds wheeled above them in patterns that looked random, but were, he knew, governed by wind currents and thermal columns, and the invisible architecture of the air that shaped their flight, the way history and trauma and choice shaped the lives of the people who stood on the stone above them and watched. Seraphine joined him. They stood together in the wind and looked at the sea and the sky and the distant horizon where water met air, and the distinction between the two blurred into a single, seamless line. "I dreamed about my father," Caedric said, "before all of this. A dream about a summer day when he took me riding along these cliffs. He said something I spent 17 years trying to forget." "What did he say?" "That the measure of a ruler is not what he takes. It is what he refuses to destroy." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "And what do you refuse to destroy?" Caedric looked at her. Then he looked at the fortress behind them, its windows beginning to glow with lamplight as evening approached. At the courtyard where servants moved without fear. At the road beyond the gates where, in the distance, a grain wagon was making its scheduled delivery to a village that would eat through the winter, because someone inside these walls had remembered that power without mercy was just occupation by another name. "This," he said. "All of this." He took her hand. She held it. And they stood on this balcony of Blackthorne Keep as the sun dropped toward the sea and the sky turned from bronze to copper to the deep, luminous amber that the northern coast produces for approximately 11 minutes at the end of clear autumn days, a light so specific and so temporary that it exists only in the exact moment you are watching it, and cannot be preserved or reproduced or held, like everything worth having. Behind them, the fortress settled into evening. Fires were lit. Bread was broken. The servants moved through corridors that no longer echoed with the silence of fear, but with the quieter, more sustainable sounds of a household learning to inhabit itself again. Caedric did not let go of her hand, not because he was afraid, because he was not. And that, after 17 years of building walls against every form of human vulnerability, was the most terrifying and most courageous thing he had ever done. Blackthorne Keep stood on the cliff edge as it had always stood, stone and iron and centuries of inheritance. But the light inside it was different now, warmer, steadier. The light of a place that was no longer a fortress or a weapon or a monument to one man's grief. It was a home, imperfect, scarred, rebuilt from the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy it, like the man who stood at its edge and looked out at the sea and held the hand of the woman who had taught him that the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is not to conquer or to punish or to build walls high enough to keep the world out. It is to let someone in.